Peace be with you. Dear friends, welcome to Living Flame Daily Gospel Reflections. Gospel for Wednesday in the third week in the ordinary time. Gospel according to Mark chapter 4, verses 1 to 20. Dear friends, how many of us garden each year? If we are in the habit of gardening, we know that we need to know the seed as well as the soil. Well, during the springtime, we understand how important it is to sow the seed and see these seeds sprout and grow. Farming has really changed over the years. Today we have tractors. Well, in the American continent and perhaps even European continent, we have tractors guided by GPS systems. They are all technically advanced. Seeds are precisely inserted into the prepared soil along with a scientifically measured shot of insecticide to combat rootworm. Some farmers still use horse-drawn planters and a few plant crops by hand. During Jesus' time, farmers used a unique method of sowing the seed. Turning to Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, we unpack the parable of the sower. The verse 1 gives us the setting. Again, he began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him, so that he got into the boat and sat in it. And the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. Jesus taught in the synagogue, and he also taught by the sea. Well, when we look at this particular setting, Jesus was practically using the situation of proclaiming to large numbers. It was not a restricted number in the synagogue, rather a huge number of people, big number of people listening to him. And he had to use the acoustic system while he used to talk from the boat. People would hear with the wind blowing from the sea towards the people. That means his words would be carried to the ears of all the people with the direction of the wind. The crowd is massive, so Jesus jumped into the boat and sat down. And he started speaking. Some authors and some experts estimated that there would be up to 10,000 people listening to Jesus on certain occasions. And he was teaching them many things in parables. Well, what is a parable? A parable means to throw something beside something else and explain the true nature and meaning. Now let us understand this parable of the sower. The parable of the sower is a parable that tells us how the sower went out to sow. Jesus wants them and us to learn in and listen. The word behold is like saying, lo, behold, I see something here that is drawing my attention. A farmer would have a leather pouch across his shoulders filled with seed and would walk down the paths slinging the seed out, much like we do when planting grass or any other plants. The seed would be used and thrown, some good, some not so good. The farmer's goal was to get his good seed into good soil so that it would grow because the seed has life in it. The seed is small but powerful and will produce fruit of the conditions that are right. But it must be planted in good soil in order to achieve its intended purpose. Now, looking at this gospel, we find as he sowed, some seed fell along the path. The birds came and devoured it. Fields in Israel were small and were separated from one another by paths that became like a concrete from all the people and animals walking on them. The seed that hit this hard ground would just lie there until the birds gobbled it up. In our culture, it would be like throwing grass seed on the sidewalk. Jesus interprets the first soil in verse 15, and these are the ones along the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. The phrase takes away means to seize with force and to rob. Notice that Satan does this immediately. He loves to bring confusion and to cause carelessness when the gospel is communicated. Now, in a hollow heart, the second soil is described in verse 5 to 6. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. In that part of the world, much of the land was solid rock with just a thin layer of soil on top. The sun would bake the rock, which would keep the soil warm, thus causing the seed to germinate quickly. But because there was no root, these plants would wither and die. When these people hear the message, they become very exuberant and emotional, enthusiastic. We look at verse 16, and these are the ones sown on rocky ground, the ones who, when they hear the word, immediately receive it with joy. The soil looks ready, but the problem comes when problems come. Because of their emotional enthusiasm, their roots didn't grow up deep, as we see in verse, and they have no root in themselves, but endure for a while. Then, when tribulations and persecutions arise on account of the word, immediately they fall away. Well, we go further in this passage. It's a long passage for our reflection today. There is a hindered heart. Seed fall on the third kind of soil only to be choked out by weeds. Jesus describes this way in verse 7. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. The word choked means choke utterly. The seed is strangled by thorns and thistles and ends up producing no produce. Jesus interprets this soil in verse 18 and 19. And others are the ones sown among thorns. They are those who hear the word, but cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. Well, the last type of seed that falls on good seed. There is only one kind of soil that produces a crop, as seen in verse 8. And other seeds fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. The good ground was not hard, hollow, or hindered. If a farmer during that time had a harvest that was 7 times what was sown, it would be called a good crop. To have yields of 30, 60, or 100 times would be astonishing. Notice the 4 words that show a continuous kind of action: produced, growing, increasing, and yielding. Dear friends, when we hear the word of God, we should be humble as the good soil, and it will grow and multiply and will bear much fruit, 30, 60, and 100-fold. God bless.